Welcome, and thank you for letting this quiet hour belong to you, wherever you happen to be resting tonight. If you can, dim the lights now, lower the brightness on your screen, and let your shoulders soften away from your ears as the room grows still around you. There is nothing you need to do for the next little while, no task waiting, no message to answer, just the slow rhythm of your own breathing and the soft sound of this voice. Tonight you will hear 6 true stories, gathered from anonymous Japanese online forums where strangers quietly share the small, strange, and tender moments of their everyday lives. These accounts were originally written in Japanese, on message boards where housewives, office workers, students, and grandparents leave fragments of their days for one another to read. They have been carefully translated into English and gently retold at a slower pace, so the words can drift past you like a long, slow current rather than ask anything sharp of your attention. Some of the stories are about workplaces and the people who pass through them, some are about families and the quiet weight of years lived under the same roof, and a few touch the edges of the unexplained, the kind of memory that sits softly at the back of the mind. None of them require you to remember names, follow every twist, or arrive at any particular conclusion before the night is through. If your thoughts wander, that is perfectly fine, and if you fall asleep before the second story, or the third, or somewhere in the middle of the fifth, that is exactly what this recording is here for. You can let the details blur, let the voices become part of the room, and let the rise and fall of the sentences carry you toward rest the way a tide carries small things gently back to shore. This program is narrated with the help of AI, kept deliberately even and steady so that nothing in the tone will pull you back into wakefulness once your breathing has begun to slow. There will be no sudden music, no sharp turns, no urgent moments designed to keep you listening, only a long, quiet ribbon of stories meant to fold neatly into the edges of your night. So settle a little deeper into the pillow, let your jaw unclench, let your hands rest open and easy, and allow the day you have just finished to drift somewhere behind you. Let's begin. In a small apartment on the eastern edge of Tokyo, on an evening when the rain had begun without quite announcing itself, a man named Hiroshi sat at the low kitchen table and listened to the kettle begin its soft, familiar complaint. The window above the sink was opened by only a finger's width, and through that small opening came the smell of wet pavement and the faint, distant sound of a train slowing toward a station 2 blocks away. He had come home later than usual that day, his coat slightly damp at the shoulders, his briefcase set down with the careful, almost apologetic quietness of a man who had trained himself, over many years, never to disturb the household by being loud. His wife, Mai, was already in the next room, lying on her side on the futon, one hand resting on the round, low rise of her belly, the other folded beneath her cheek as she half watched a variety show with the volume turned almost all the way down. She was 7 months along, the doctor had said, and the small life inside her was a boy, and the room around her, with its faint scent of new tatami and its soft yellow lamplight, seemed to have been arranged, slowly and lovingly, for his arrival. Hiroshi poured the hot water into a thick brown teapot, watched the leaves unfurl like tiny dark hands opening, and let himself feel, for one long breath, that everything in his life was in its proper place. They had been trying for a child for nearly 5 years, and the path to this evening had been long, and at times harder than either of them had known how to describe to anyone outside the small circle of their marriage. There had been clinics with pale blue waiting rooms, and folders of paperwork, and quiet train rides home where neither of them spoke, and there had been a long winter in which Mai had stopped answering messages from her old school friends because she could not bear, just yet, to hear about their children. He had loved her through all of it, in his particular, unflashy way, the way a careful gardener loves a plant that has been slow to bloom, and when at last the test had shown 2 soft pink lines, he had thought, with a relief that was almost painful, that the difficult years were behind them. They had made a small agreement, early on in the treatment, almost as a joke between them, that if the baby were a girl, Mai would choose the name, and if the baby were a boy, the choosing would fall to him. The agreement had felt, at the time, like a soft promise made under the warm lamp of a future they were both still daring to believe in, and neither of them had imagined that a promise made so quietly could one day stand in the center of the room like a wall. He carried the small tray of tea into the living room and set it down beside her, and she smiled at him in the low light, and for a moment the apartment felt the way it had always felt on rainy evenings, settled and small and entirely their own. She told him then, in the offhand way one mentioned something already long decided, that she had been thinking again about the name, and that she had finally chosen one she wished to give to their son. The name, she said, was not a Japanese name, not in any ordinary sense, but the name of a beautiful and dangerous swordsman from a video game she had loved since her teenage years, a character with silver hair and a long coat and a sorrow she had once stayed up late nights trying to understand. Hiroshi held his cup very still, and the steam rose past his face, and in the small space between her finishing the sentence and his finding any answer at all, he heard the rain beginning to fall more steadily on the metal balcony outside. He said gently that the name was lovely in its own way, but that it was not a name that a Japanese child could carry easily through a Japanese life, and that perhaps they might think of something a little quieter, a little closer to the names of the boys who would one day stand beside their son in a school hallway. Mai did not raise her voice, but the air of the room cooled by a small, perceptible degree, and she told him that she had carried this child through years she did not wish to relive, and that the choosing of his name was the one thing she had imagined for herself through all of it. He listened, and he understood, and he said again, more softly than before, that he understood, and yet he asked her if she would consider, only consider, a second name in case the first one day became a weight the boy could not carry. She said that there would be no second name, and that the world she remembered from her own girlhood was no longer the world the boy would grow up in, and that names like the one she had chosen would, in time, become as ordinary as anything else. Outside, a moped passed in the lane below, its small engine fading into the wet streets, and the kettle, now empty, ticked once as it cooled on the burner. The days that followed were not unkind, exactly, but they had a careful, glassy quality, the way a household feels when something important has been set down between two people and neither of them is quite ready to pick it up again. He went to work, and he came home, and he placed his shoes in the genkan with the quiet precision of a man who was trying to be a good husband to a wife he loved and could no longer fully reach. At his desk in the evenings he would sometimes type into the small search bar of his laptop the kinds of questions a man asks only when he is lonely inside his own house, questions about names, and about marriages, and about how other people had carried their disagreements through the long years that follow a child's birth. He read, in those quiet hours, that names of that flashy and unusual kind had earned a small, unhappy nickname among Japanese internet users, a label suggesting that the parents had not thought carefully enough about the long road ahead of the child. He read also that other men, in other apartments, had sat exactly where he sat now, with exactly his cup of tea cooling beside them, trying to find the gentle words that would change a wife's mind without breaking the soft, careful peace of a pregnancy. He thought, more than once, of his own family name, which was longer than most, and which had given him 1,000 small embarrassments in his school years, and he found himself thinking that perhaps he understood, more than Mai knew, exactly what a name could do across a lifetime. He told her these things in soft, considered sentences over a dinner of grilled fish and rice and the small pickled vegetables her mother had sent up from the country, and she listened, and she nodded, and yet the name did not change. He suggested, almost shyly, that they could borrow only the sound of the name she loved, and shape it into something quieter, something that could be written in ordinary characters and read without difficulty by an ordinary teacher on an ordinary morning. She said that a half-name was no name at all, and that she had not endured those years of waiting only to give her son something half-remembered and half-ashamed. He nodded, and he cleared the plates, and he washed them slowly under the warm water of the kitchen tap, and he felt, for the first time in their marriage, that his hands knew something his heart had not yet allowed itself to say. A week later he found, almost by accident, a small order form on the dining table, the kind of form one fills out for embroidered baby items, and on that form, in Mai's careful, looping handwriting, the name had already been written down as though the matter had long ago been settled. He stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at that single line of ink, and he understood, with a quiet, low ache in his chest, that the conversation he had been having with his wife had not, in her mind, been a conversation at all. He went, the next weekend, to his own parents' house in a quiet neighborhood near a small shrine, and he told them, over green tea and a plate of rice crackers, what was happening, and his mother set down her cup very gently and did not speak for a long while. His father, an old-fashioned man who had spent his working years in a small printing shop, said only that a name was the first gift one gave to a child, and that it ought to be a gift the child could carry without flinching for the rest of his life. They did not press him toward any decision, because they had always been careful, in the soft way of older parents, never to put their thumb on the scale of their son's marriage, but he saw in their faces the worry they did not say aloud. He walked home from the station that evening through streets where lanterns had begun to glow, and he passed a small park where a father was teaching a boy to ride a bicycle, the boy laughing and falling and getting up again with the bright, unembarrassed energy of a child whose name fit him as easily as his own skin. He thought, in that moment, of the boy who would soon be his, and he found himself thinking that what he wanted, more than anything, was for that boy to laugh that easily, in a park like this, on an evening like this, without any small invisible weight pulling at him from the page of a school roll. The rest of the summer passed slowly, the way summers in Tokyo do, with cicadas in the trees and the air heavy and warm and the laundry never quite drying on the small balcony. Mai, near her 9th month, returned to her parents' home in the country, as many young mothers do, to give birth in the quiet familiarity of the house where she herself had been a child. He visited her there once, on a weekend when the rice fields outside the town shimmered green and full, and he tried, in front of her parents and over a long, careful dinner, to explain his worry about the name. Her father listened with a furrowed, kind face, and her mother listened with the more complicated expression of a woman who had once been a daughter herself, and the room around them smelled of grilled mackerel and the clean, dry sweetness of new straw matting. He spoke softly, as he always did, and he tried not to make of his wife a stranger in front of the people who loved her best, and yet by the end of that evening he understood that the disagreement had grown larger than any one of them, and that the soft chords of the marriage had begun, very quietly, to fray. When he returned to the city, the apartment seemed too large, and the kettle seemed too loud, and the evenings, which had once been a kind of gentle agreement between two tired people, became long, careful hours of his own thoughts. He spoke once to a lawyer, almost shyly, in a small office on the 7th floor of a building near the station, and the lawyer told him, kindly, that the law in Japan did not see a name as the kind of injury a court would untangle, and that whatever happened next would have to be worked out in the older, slower language of family. He nodded, and he thanked the lawyer, and he walked home through a thin grey rain, and he understood that there were some sorrows for which there was no clean office and no clean form to fill out. The boy was born early in September, by the gentle planning of a scheduled caesarean, in a hospital surrounded by low pine trees in his wife's hometown. Hiroshi did not, in the end, see his son on the day he was born, for reasons he would not, for many years, find the right words to describe even to himself, and the absence of that meeting would sit in him afterward like a small, permanent stone. The boy, it turned out, would need a great deal of care that no one had been able to predict, a quiet, lifelong care that would change the shape of every plan his mother had once made for him. And the name, which had stood so long between them like a closed door, was in the end written down quickly, in the small office of a town hall, on a morning when many other things were also being decided in haste. Hiroshi learned of the boy's arrival by a phone call he took standing in the hallway of his apartment, the receiver pressed to his ear, the rain again beginning outside, and he did not know whether to feel joy or grief, and so he stood for a long time feeling something quieter than either. Months later, when the first cool days of autumn had arrived, Mai wrote to him, in a long, careful letter folded into a plain white envelope, asking whether they might find a way back to each other for the sake of the small boy who was now, beyond any question, the most important person in either of their lives. She wrote that she had been proud, and that she had been frightened, and that she had mistaken the loudness of her own wishes for the deepness of her own love, and she wrote that she was sorry for the things she had said and for the things she had not. He read the letter twice, sitting at the same low table where they had once shared their small evening teas, and he felt, as he read, the soft, complicated weight of a marriage that had ended without ever quite turning into a marriage that hated itself. He did not answer for several days, because he had learned, in that long year, that the kindest answers are often the slowest ones, and because he no longer wanted to speak in any voice but the most careful one he could find. When at last he wrote back, he wrote only that he wished her and the boy a quiet and well cared for life, and that he would honor what he could of his old promises, and that he hoped, in time, to be a part of the boy's life in whatever small and steady way the future allowed. He did not write of the name, because by then the name had become only one thread in a much wider cloth, and he understood that arguing about a thread, when the cloth itself had already been folded away, was a thing only a younger man would have done. The boy grew, in the slow and patient way that boys with such gentle differences sometimes grow, and Mai learned, in the years that followed, a kind of quietness she had not known in her younger life, the quietness of someone who has been humbled by the great, ordinary love of caring for another person. Hiroshi came to visit on certain Saturdays, and he would sit on the tatami floor of her parents' house and let the boy play with a small wooden train, and the room would smell of green tea and warm rice, and the afternoon light would slant in through the paper screens. He found that he loved the child completely, with a love that did not depend on any name at all, and he found that the name itself, which had once seemed so unbearable to him, was simply a sound the boy answered to, no more and no less. He found also that the boy's mother, whom he had once thought he could not forgive, had become, in her own quiet way, a person he could speak to gently across a low table, and that whatever had broken between them had also, somehow, made room for something simpler to grow in its place. There are stories, he came to think, that begin in a great noise of disagreement and end in a quiet that no one in the early days could have imagined, and theirs, perhaps, was a story like that. And so the rain falls on the eaves of a house in a country town, and a small boy sleeps under a soft, clean futon, and his mother folds a blanket, and his father, in another city, washes a single teacup at the sink and sets it carefully on the wooden rack to dry. The kettle is quiet now, and the lamps are low, and somewhere a train is slowing toward a station 2 blocks away, and the night around them is the soft, ordinary night that follows even the most difficult of years. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, with the rain on the roof and the slow, even breathing of a small child, and the long, careful peace of two people who learned, almost too late, how gently a life must be carried. And so we leave that hallway behind, the soft echo of footsteps fading into the quiet, the dim light folding gently into memory, no need to carry any of it with you now. Take a slow breath in, and a slower breath out, and let the room around you settle a little deeper into its stillness. There is no rush, no place you need to be, only this gentle drift between one story and the next. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a face remembered through the soft blur of years, a voice that returns the way old songs return on quiet evenings. Rest here a moment longer, and when you are ready, we will begin again, slowly, softly. In a small apartment somewhere on the quiet edges of a Japanese suburb, the late afternoon light came through the curtains the color of warm milk, and a woman sat at her low wooden table with both hands wrapped around a slowly cooling cup of tea. She was, by her own telling, a few years past her divorce, and the silence of her rooms had grown into a kind of furniture, soft and familiar, present in every corner where another person might once have stood. On a perch by the window, a small grey cockatiel turned its head toward the kitchen, and the woman, whose name we will not say tonight, watched it sleepily, the way one watches something whose company is steady and undemanding. The bird was called Gorgonzola, a name her younger sister had chosen years ago for reasons no one could now remember, and the woman had simply kept it, the way one keeps a souvenir from a trip whose purpose has long since faded. The kettle on the counter hummed and clicked, and somewhere outside a delivery scooter passed by with a small rattling cough, and the day, she found herself thinking, was settling into evening without asking anything of her. She had told herself, in the first weeks after her marriage ended, that she would build a clean and clear life on the other side of it, and for a while this was the story she repeated to her colleagues and her mother and to herself. But stories, when you live alone with a small bird and a kettle and a low table, have a way of unraveling at the edges, and lately she had begun to find herself thinking of her former husband at strange and unexpected hours. She thought of him while folding laundry, and on the train, and in the soft pause between dropping into bed and falling asleep, and these thoughts were not quite memories and not quite plans, but something halfway between the two. The marriage itself, she would later realize, had been a quieter thing than she remembered, full of his small daily kindnesses that she had not, at the time, recognized as kindnesses at all. He had cooked for them on weekday evenings, the rice cooker steaming gently in the background, and he had brought in the laundry from the balcony before the rain arrived, and he had spoken softly to the bird and called her by silly diminutive names. At the time, none of this had seemed like devotion to her, only like a strange softness she did not know how to receive, and she had found herself irritated by it in a way she could not entirely explain. She had been irritated, she would later say, by the way he left the bathroom door slightly open, and by the way he wandered into the kitchen when she had not asked him to, and by the way he taught new phrases to Gorgonzola without consulting her. When she had tried to argue with him about these things, he had a tendency to slip away into another room rather than respond, and this, more than anything, had felt to her like a small daily refusal she did not know how to forgive. And so, after many such weeks and months, the marriage had ended in the polite paperwork way that Japanese divorces often do, with seals stamped on documents and a quiet exchange of household items at the door. She had thought, at the time, that her head would clear once she was alone again, and for a while, in a certain shallow way, it did, and the apartment grew used to one set of footsteps instead of two. Years passed in the manner that years do when no one is keeping count of them, and the bird grew older and quieter, and the woman went on with her work and her small routines and her occasional tea with her sister on Sundays. Then, one ordinary afternoon in a department store in the center of the city, with the soft music of the floor announcements playing overhead, she saw him without warning, walking past a long row of escalators. He did not see her, and for that she was, in the moment, grateful, because what she saw beside him was a tall foreign woman with pale hair and easy posture, and between them a small girl of perhaps 2 years old, holding both their hands. The little family moved through the bright aisles in the calm rhythm that families have when nothing is wrong, and the woman stood at a slight distance, and felt something old and badly buried turn over inside her chest. She found herself thinking that he had remarried without telling her, and that he had become a father without telling her, and that all of this had happened in the world while she was folding laundry alone in her own quiet apartment. She knew, somewhere underneath, that he owed her none of this information, that they were strangers now in the eyes of the law and the eyes of the city, and yet the feeling she carried home with her on the train was not entirely reasonable. For several days she did not sleep well, and Gorgonzola watched her from the perch with the steady, indifferent eyes of a bird who has seen many small human storms and survived them all. Then, one morning, she put on her coat and took a train to the small house at the edge of the city where her former husband's family had always lived, and she rang the bell at their gate. What happened on the doorstep that day was not kind, and she would not, in later years, want to describe it in any detail, and so we will pass over it at a gentle distance tonight. It is enough to say that the foreign wife came to the door, that hard words were exchanged on both sides, that there was a brief and unhappy scuffle in the front yard, and that an elderly neighbor eventually stepped in to part them. The woman went home that evening with a small bruise on her arm and a deeper bruise on her pride, and she sat at her low table and turned, as so many lonely people do, to the small bright window of the internet. She wrote her story onto an anonymous forum, the way one might whisper into a well, and she expected, perhaps, sympathy, or counsel, or at least the gentle nodding of strangers who agreed she had been wronged. What she received instead, in the slow tumble of replies that came in over the long evening, was the rough and patient honesty of strangers who had no reason to flatter her and no reason to spare her either. They asked her, without unkindness but without softness either, why she believed her former husband needed rescuing, and why she believed his happiness with another woman amounted to a kind of trouble he could not see for himself. She tried to explain, in long and tangled sentences, that she had known him longer, that she understood him better, that the foreign wife was a stranger to their country and their habits, and that she was simply trying to help. The strangers replied, with the calm rhythm of people who had seen this kind of letter before, that her former husband was a grown man with a wife and a small daughter, and that her help was, in plain truth, a kind of intrusion. She found herself, as the evening went on, defending positions she had not quite known she held, and arguing with phrases she had not quite known she would use, and slowly, as the hours passed, something in her began to shift. One stranger pointed out, with dry patience, that she had once divorced this man because his small daily kindnesses irritated her, and that she now wished to return to him because another woman had accepted those same kindnesses gladly. Another stranger asked her, gently enough, whether she had told her former husband, in any clear or fair way, what had specifically displeased her during their marriage, and she found, to her surprise, that she had to admit that she had not. She had, she wrote, simply grown silent and resentful, and waited for him to understand, and when he did not understand, she had taken her resentment as proof that he was at fault, and she had carried that proof out of the marriage like a souvenir. The strangers received this confession with a kind of weary kindness, and they told her, plainly, that her former husband had not been the heavy one in the marriage, but rather the light one whose lightness she had refused to see. While she typed, the phone in the corner of the room began to ring, and she let it ring, and after a while the small answering machine took down the voice of her mother asking, again, whether she had eaten properly that day. Her mother had begun, in recent months, to mention the son of an old family friend, in the patient and roundabout way that mothers in such families have, and the woman had found this attention more wearying than comforting. She thought, sitting in the lamplight with the bird on its perch, that her mother had perhaps known for some time that something was tilting in her daughter's heart, and that the mention of the family friend was a hand quietly extended. She did not, that night, take her mother's hand, and she did not call her back, but she made a small note in the notebook beside the phone, in handwriting more careful than she usually used, that she would call her in the morning. Later, as the strangers on the forum continued their slow work of holding up a clear mirror, she began to write less and to read more, and the bright reasoning she had brought with her began, line by line, to soften. Someone wrote, with surprising gentleness, that loving someone meant wishing for their happiness, even when that happiness was elsewhere, and that this was not a poetic idea but a small, daily, practical discipline. Another stranger added, with the same gentleness, that wishing the foreign wife away would not return her former husband to her, but would only confirm, to anyone watching, that she had not yet learned what the years were trying to teach her. She read these words several times, and then she got up from the low table and made a fresh cup of tea, and she stood for a long while at the kitchen counter watching the steam rise into the soft lamplight. When she returned to the keyboard, she wrote that perhaps she had been wrong, in a small way, and the strangers, kindly, said that perhaps she had been wrong in a slightly larger way than that. And then, in the middle of this slow and careful conversation, the phone rang again, and this time the number on the screen was one she had not seen for many years, and she picked it up before her hands had quite decided to. It was her former mother-in-law, speaking in the soft and patient voice she had always used, and the call was not angry, and the call was not cruel, and the call was, in the end, the kind that long love often is. Her former mother-in-law said that her son was settled now, and that the small girl was beginning to learn her first words, and that the foreign wife, whom she had grown to love, was trying carefully to learn the manners of the country. Her former mother-in-law said, very gently, that she hoped the woman might find her own quiet happiness somewhere along her own path, and that she would not, perhaps, need to call this house again. The woman listened to all of this with her hand half over her mouth, and she made small sounds of agreement that were not quite words, and when the call ended, the apartment seemed both larger and smaller than it had been before. She sat for a while with the bird and the cooling tea, and she found that she was not, at that moment, angry, but only tired, in the deep way that one is tired after a day of carrying a heavy thing without quite realizing. Some time later, much later in the evening, the phone rang a third time, and this time the voice on the other end belonged to her former husband, calling her directly, in a tone she remembered well from long ago. He spoke quietly, the way he had always spoken, and he told her, without anger and without cruelty, that he would not be coming back to her, and that his life now belonged to his wife and to their small daughter. He told her that he wished her well, and that he hoped she would find someone whose company suited her better than his own had done, and he asked her, kindly, not to come to the house again. She listened, and she did not argue, and when he had finished speaking, she said only that she understood, in the soft and even voice that one uses for words one has just learned how to mean. After he hung up, she sat for a long time looking at the phone in her hand, and the bird made a small sound on its perch, and the apartment was quiet in the way quiet rooms are after something has finally been said aloud. She did not cry, that night, in any large way, but a little water gathered in her eyes and slid into her tea, and she did not wipe it away, because it seemed, somehow, to belong there. On the forum, she wrote a short and simple note, telling the strangers that her former husband had spoken to her clearly, and that she understood now, and that she would not be making any more visits to anyone's house. The strangers, in their rough and patient way, wrote back small good wishes, and someone made a gentle joke about the bird called Gorgonzola, and someone else suggested that she go to bed, because it had been a long evening for everyone. She closed the laptop, and she covered the cage for the night, and she stood for a moment by the window, looking down at the street where a single bicycle was passing slowly beneath the orange lamps. She thought, then, with a calmness that surprised her, that she had spent several years trying to arrange the world so that she would not have to grow, and that the world had quietly, patiently, refused her arrangement. She thought, too, that her former husband had never been the wrong man, but only a man whose softness she had not been ready to receive, and that perhaps, in time, she might learn to receive softness in someone else. She thought of her mother and the family friend's son, and she thought of the colleagues at her workplace who had laughed gently at her stories, and she thought of her sister who had named the bird so absurdly long ago. And she thought that none of these people had given up on her, even when she had, for a little while, given up on the harder and quieter work of becoming a person who could live well in the company of others. The kettle had gone cold on the counter, and the lamp in the corner buzzed faintly, and outside the window a soft rain began to fall on the rooftops of the neighborhood in the unhurried way of Japanese spring rain. The bird, beneath its cover, made one last small noise that sounded almost like a good night, and the woman smiled, in the smallest possible way, and reached over and turned off the lamp. She did not, that night, plan what she would do in the morning, and she did not, for once, write any more long letters to strangers on the internet, and she did not rehearse any clever speeches in her head. She simply unrolled her futon onto the tatami, and she lay down in the dark with her hands folded over her chest, and she listened to the rain on the roof tiles in the way one listens to an old friend. Somewhere in the city, her former husband was perhaps reading a small picture book to a small girl in a small lamplit room, and somewhere else her mother was perhaps already asleep, and her sister was perhaps watching late television. And somewhere, in a quiet apartment with a cooling kettle and a covered cage and a soft grey rain on the roof, a woman who had spent a long day learning a difficult lesson allowed herself, at last, to close her eyes. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, in the soft hush of an ordinary apartment on an ordinary street, with the rain on the tiles, and the bird asleep, and the woman finally, gently, still. And so we leave that hallway behind, the echoes of footsteps fading into the soft hush of memory, the door at its end closing without a sound. There is no need to carry it with you now. Let your shoulders settle a little deeper into the pillow, let your jaw unclench, and take one slow breath in, and a longer breath out. Our next story takes us to a darker corner of the country, somewhere quieter, somewhere older, where the trees grow close together and the wind moves through them in long, patient sighs. There is no rush at all. Rest here for a moment, in this small pause between one tale and the next, and when you are ready, we will drift gently onward together. The afternoon in those mountains held a particular kind of quietness, the sort that settles on rural Japan when the cicadas pause between their songs and the warm air seems to listen back at anyone who steps into it. Two boys had wandered higher up the slope than they should have, drawn on by the small thrill of finding shed snakeskins, those papery treasures that the older men of the village would sometimes accept in exchange for a piece of fruit or a sweet from the cupboard. The grandfather, when he later told this part of the story, would always pause here and say that he had been about that age where curiosity feels like courage, and where a warning given softly at breakfast can be forgotten by lunchtime among the tall grass. His friend Kanji walked a little behind him, swinging a thin stick at the heads of the seeded grasses, and the two of them spoke in that easy, half-distracted way that boys speak when they are absorbed by the ground in front of them rather than the path ahead. They had crossed an unmarked threshold without noticing it, where the trees grew older and the leaves underfoot felt slightly cooler, and where the whole forest gathered itself into a hush that should have warned them, had they known how to hear such a hush. Above them, at the top of the climb, an old wooden Torii gate stood weathered and pale, its crossbeams faintly green with moss, framing a narrow stone path that led further up toward the small village shrine. The shrine itself was the kind known in those parts as a Goryo shrine, a place built long ago to settle the spirit of a person who had died wrongly, so that the grief of that death would not turn outward into something restless and wandering. The villagers, when they spoke of the deity within, used a long and elaborate name that no one could quite remember in full, and so among themselves the older people simply called it Kushina-sama, which is something close to the Lord of the Withered Cord, or the slowly rotting rope. Kushina-sama, they said, was the keeper of bones, a presence whose shape sometimes drifted down into the village as a snake or a slender woman, and who watched over expectant mothers and the soft bones of newborn children when the families brought offerings to the shrine. The grandfather had heard all of this in fragments at the kitchen table, sitting on a worn cushion while the kettle hissed faintly on the stove, and he had nodded the way children nod, gathering the words without yet understanding their weight. He had also been told, more firmly than the rest, that no child should approach the Torii alone, and that if for some reason a child did, they should turn around at once, bow once toward the slope, and walk home without looking back and without speaking. Yet here he was now, far past the soft warning, with the gate already visible through the trunks of the cedars, its red paint long faded into the color of dried persimmons left out for the winter on a high shelf. Kanji noticed it first, lifting his head and shading his eyes with one small hand, and he murmured that they had come too far, that the gate was right in front of them now, and that surely it was time to turn back toward the fields below. The grandfather agreed, in the small uncertain voice that boys use when they want to seem unworried, and the two of them began to slow, looking around at the cedar trunks as though searching the bark for permission to retreat. It was then, at that exact moment of softening attention, that a figure appeared on the path ahead of them, walking slowly down from the direction of the shrine, drifting closer with a calmness that felt almost rehearsed in advance. She was a woman, or seemed to be one, dressed not in the everyday work clothes that the village women wore among the rice paddies, but in a pale, almost whitish robe that resembled a thin yukata more suited to a summer evening than to a forest afternoon. Her hair lay long down her back, dark in a way that did not catch the light, and her steps did not seem to disturb the leaves beneath her feet, even though the boy's own footsteps had crackled audibly all the way up the slope. The grandfather felt at once that he was about to be scolded for wandering somewhere forbidden, and he leaned toward Kanji and whispered, in the smallest voice he could manage, that perhaps they should apologize quickly, or perhaps they should simply turn and run. Kanji turned his head, squinted, and then squinted further, looking past the woman as if trying to see through a thin haze that no one had warned him about, and he answered slowly that he could not see anyone there at all, and asked who exactly was approaching. It was in that small reply, that strange small reply spoken in his friend's ordinary voice, that the grandfather first felt the cold slide down his back, because the figure was perfectly clear to him, and to him only, growing nearer with each unhurried step. As the distance closed between them, her face came into focus, and what should have been ordinary features became something that the mind refused to settle on, the way the eye refuses to look directly into the center of the sun. Her eyes were the eyes of a snake, set wide apart in the slim oval of her face, narrow vertical slits within small pale rounds, the kind of eyes one finds painted onto the carved wood of certain very old shrines tucked deep into the hills. Her nose was thin, almost bladed, and her mouth was very small, drawn in a single quiet line that did not seem inclined to open, and her whole body had the slightness of a reed leaning in a still pond after rain. The grandfather found that his legs would not move, that his breath had become very shallow, and that he could feel his own heartbeat in the soft places behind his ears, as though something deep inside him had been called sharply to attention. Beside him, Kanji's voice continued at a strange distance, asking what was wrong, urging him to come away, and the grandfather felt those words pass over him like the sound of water heard from beneath a heavy quilt drawn up over the head. The woman, having come close enough now that her presence took up the center of the path, blinked once, slowly, and then began to do something that the grandfather would later struggle to describe, even decades afterward in his own kitchen with a cup of tea cooling at his elbow. Her arms began to bend, gently at first, in directions that arms are not meant to bend, as though the bones inside them had become as soft as wet rope, as though her elbows belonged to a different kind of creature entirely. Her legs followed, sliding sideways from the knee, and her shoulders sagged and rose in a slow, uneven rhythm, as though she were a marionette whose strings had been cut and then loosely retied by an unfamiliar hand working without a guide. There was no sound to any of this, no clicking of joints, no rustle of fabric, only the soft afternoon wind moving high in the cedars and the boy's own pulse pressing against the inside of his ears. Then she tilted her head, slowly, leaning it sideways onto her shoulder, and continued tilting it, past the angle at which a head ordinarily stops, past any natural limit, until her hair hung down before her chest like dark river weed. Her head came to rest fully inverted in the air just above her own ribs, the chin pointing upward, the parted line of her mouth turned toward the sky, the snake eyes now looking out from a face that had been turned upside down entirely. The grandfather did not scream, although he later wondered why, and he stood in the path with his hands stiff at his sides, feeling all the warmth drain out of his small body as though through a narrow hole he had not known was there. She seemed to register his stillness with something close to pleasure, the corners of her small mouth lifting slightly, and her bent and folded limbs adjusted themselves until her inverted face hung level with his own, very close, almost near enough to touch. From that strange near distance she spoke, and her voice was soft and amused, and she observed in a tone almost like teasing that he could see her, could he not, and that there was no point pretending otherwise to one such as herself. The grandfather, who would later say that he had been a foolish boy and had given the wrong answer out of fear, shook his head as hard as he could and insisted, through tears that had begun without his permission, that he could not see anything at all. At this the woman seemed to grow more pleased rather than less, and she narrowed her snake eyes and remarked that he was a cheeky child, that of course he could see her, and that he need not bother lying to one such as herself. Beside him, Kanji was speaking again, urging him to come along, asking what he was staring at so intently, and the grandfather could feel his friend's confusion as a faint pressure at the edge of an otherwise frozen and silent world. The woman, with the slow grace of something uncoiling itself from a long sleep, brought her body back into ordinary alignment, the head righting itself, the limbs settling, the joints finding human angles once again, until she stood before him as she had at first. She smiled, then, in a way that was almost gentle, almost kind, the way an adult smiles at a small bird that has wandered in through an open window and is now resting unsuspecting on the rim of an empty teacup. She told him, in that same soft voice, that she would come for him that very night, that he should wait for her, that she would find him wherever he might be, and that he was not to be afraid before she arrived. As she spoke, she reached out and let one cool fingertip pass across the back of his small left hand, drawing slowly along the smallest finger, lingering at the joint nearest the tip in a touch that felt longer than it was. Then she turned with the easy weightlessness of smoke and walked back up the path, away through the lichen-spotted Torii gate, and the forest behind her seemed to close around her, form the way still water closes around a quietly dropped stone. For several long seconds the grandfather did not move at all, and then the held breath in his chest collapsed all at once, and he began to weep without sound, his small shoulders shaking in the dappled afternoon light. Kanji, finally understanding that something true and bad had happened, took him by the arm and began to lead him back down the slope, asking nothing, saying only that they should go home, that they should go home now, that they should hurry. The walk down was longer than the walk up had been. The way returning is always longer when the body is tired and the heart is full, and the boys did not speak again until they reached the edge of the lower rice fields. His mother was at the near edge of the family plot, bent over a row of young plants, her sleeves tied back with cord, and she looked up at the sound of his crying and at once dropped the small green stems she was holding. She gathered him to her without questions, the smell of warm earth and dried grass clinging to her clothes, and she made the small soothing sounds that mothers make when a child arrives broken in some way they cannot yet name aloud. His father came across the field a moment later, drawn by the unusual stillness of the scene, and the grandfather, between trembling breaths, told them in fragments what he had seen up by the gate above. He told them about the woman in the white robe, about the eyes that were not human eyes, about the way her arms and legs had bent, and about the head that had turned itself upside down to look at him from below. He told them, in the smallest voice of all, that the woman had said she would come for him that night, and that she had touched his small left hand, and that he did not know what any of it could possibly mean. The color drained out of his mother's face as he spoke, slowly, the way warmth leaves a room when a door has been left open in winter, and his father's mouth set into a line that the boy had never quite seen there before. Without speaking further, his father turned and went at a pace that was not quite a run, in the direction of the small house at the foot of the shrine path where the Kanushi, the village priest, lived alone with his books and his evening tea. His mother stayed with him there at the edge of the field, holding his hand, especially the small left hand that had been touched, and she did not let it go even when the wind moved through the grass and the afternoon began its long slow tilt toward evening. When his father returned, the priest was walking beside him, an old man with very straight posture and a face that wore patience the way other faces wear weather, and they both came directly to where the boy was sitting on a low stone. The priest knelt down so that his eyes were level with the boy's, and he asked him in a voice that was not unkind but was very serious to tell the story again, leaving nothing out, even what seemed too strange to say aloud a second time. The grandfather told it once more slowly, and the priest listened without interruption, his hands folded in his lap, and he nodded only once, near the part about the woman's inverted face hanging close before the boy's own. When the telling was finished, the priest asked to see the small left hand, and he took it in his own dry, careful fingers, and he examined each of the small fingers in turn, pressing them gently, bending them very slightly. He came at last to the smallest finger, and he held it for a long time, turning it in the soft fading light, frowning with something that was not anger but close to it, before he set the hand back into the boy's lap with great care. Then he said, in the same level voice he had used throughout, that the small bone of the very tip was no longer present, that he could feel where it had been taken from inside, and that the boy had been marked, deliberately and clearly, by Kushina-sama herself. The grandfather, hearing this, reached over with his other hand and pressed at the tip of his own little finger, and felt with a slow chill that what the priest had said was true, that the bone was gone, and that the small finger now bent loosely under any pressure at all. He had not noticed until that very moment, and he understood, with a child's clear and terrible logic, that something had been taken from inside him while he had been busy with his eyes, and that he had not even felt the loss as it happened. His mother lowered her face into her hands then, briefly, and his father stood with his arms crossed tightly over his chest as though holding something inside that he did not wish to let out, and the priest spoke again, more softly, more steadily. He explained, without dressing up the words, that Kushina-sama had taken the small bone as a kind of mark, the way one might tie a colored thread to the leg of a chosen bird, so that she could find the boy again when she returned that evening to claim him. He explained that this taking, this claiming, was an old pattern, one that the village had known of before, and that it had a known shape and a known set of countermeasures, and that they were not, therefore, without recourse this evening. He explained, finally, that he himself would speak with Kushina-sama on the boy's behalf when the time came, and that until then there was preparation to be done, and that this preparation would require the quiet help of many neighbors. The grandfather did not understand most of these words at the time, only that the priest was calm, and that the adults around him were moving with the quiet efficiency of people who have been frightened often enough to know how to act through their fear. The priest then drew from a small cloth pouch a length of bright red cord, almost the color of the faded Torii above, and a slip of folded paper marked with characters drawn in deliberate ink along its length. He took the boy's left hand once more and wound the red cord carefully around the smallest finger, several turns, neither tight nor loose, and tied it in a small knot, and then tucked the folded paper beneath the winding so that it pressed flat against the skin. He instructed the boy in the firmest tone he had used yet that this cord and this paper were not to be removed under any circumstances until the following morning, and that even in sleep the small left hand must remain bound exactly as it was now. Then the priest stood up, bowed once toward the slope and the gate above, and walked back down the path between the rice fields without looking behind him, and the boy and his parents were left in the soft fading light of early evening. His mother lifted him then, even though he was nearly too old for it, and carried him toward the house with a slowness that was not weariness but something else, something closer to the careful walk of a person carrying water in an unsealed bowl. Behind them, the mountain held the shrine, and the shrine held its quiet, and the trees above the Torii gate continued their gentle conversation with the afternoon wind, indifferent perhaps, or perhaps merely patient and waiting. And the boy, with the bright red cord wound about the smallest finger of his small left hand, looked once over his mother's shoulder toward the slope they had left behind, and then closed his eyes against it, and the day began its slow folding into night. And that, perhaps, is where this part of the story rests for tonight, with a marked finger, a soft red thread, and a promise yet to come, while the listener drifts a little further from the waking world into the quiet beyond it. And so we leave that hallway behind, with its long shadows and the soft hush of footsteps that no longer follow anyone home. You can let the image dissolve now, like breath fading from a cold window, and there is no need to hold on to any of it. Take a slow breath in through the nose, and an even slower one out, and let the quiet settle around your shoulders like a heavy, familiar blanket. There is no rush, no hurry, no place you need to be. Our next story takes us to a darker corner of the country, far from the city lights, where the trees grow close together and the nights are very, very long. Stay with me, gently, as we drift toward it together. Tonight the story moves from coffins and quiet rooms into something a little different, into a small house at the very edge of a village, where the road runs out and the forest begins, and where, for one whole summer, a strange thing happened almost every night at almost the same time. The teller of this part of the story was a high school student then, second year, 16 or 17 years old, the kind of age where a person sleeps lightly because the world feels too interesting to fully close his eyes against. His family lived deep in the countryside, in what he himself called Duinaka, a phrase that means roughly the deepest, most rural country, a place where neighbors are far apart and the night is allowed to be properly dark. Behind the house there were no other houses at all, only a narrow gravel track that climbed gently into the trees, and behind that track only forest, dense and old, with cedar and pine standing close together like patient guests. The boy had grown up there, and he knew the shape of the woods the way other children might know the shape of a familiar park, and he knew, too, that the gravel road did not lead anywhere. It was not a road in the proper sense, only a quiet path used by foresters now and then, and beyond a certain point it simply ended, fading into ferns and the soft brown carpet of fallen needles. That was the first thing that made the new habit strange, because for most of that summer, every night, at very nearly 10 o'clock, a single motorbike would come along the lane and turn into the trees and disappear. He noticed it first by accident, lying in his room with the window cracked open, listening to the air cool, and hearing the small clean sound of an engine pass and fade among the trunks. He thought at the time that perhaps a forester or a hunter was working late, the kind of older man who knew the shape of every slope and rode without lights because his eyes had learned the dark a long time ago. But then it happened again the next night at the same hour, and the next after that, and the regularity of it began to lodge in his mind like a small splinter that he could not quite ignore. He mentioned it at supper, simply and without drama, asking his parents whether they had seen the bike that came up the lane every night, and his mother shook her head and said she had not noticed. His father, busy with rice, said only that it was probably a hunter, or one of the men who looked after the pine forest, and that the boy should not bother himself with thoughts about strangers passing in the night. This was, the boy felt, a sensible answer, and he tried to be content with it, but the explanation did not quite hold its shape, because the family dog, who lived outside and slept under the eaves, never barked once when the bike went by. He found this small fact returning to him later, in the quiet between thoughts, because the dog barked at almost everything, at deer, at foxes, at the wind in the bamboo, at the old neighbor who passed by on his bicycle each morning. A motorbike, even a familiar one, ought to have stirred something in the dog, some lift of the ears, some low warning rumble, and yet the dog only slept, the way it slept on any other night. As the summer deepened, the boy noticed something else, that although he heard the bike enter the forest each night, he had never, not once, heard it come back out, and this began to settle on him slowly, the way mist settles on a field. He told himself perhaps it left while he was sleeping, or by some other path he did not know about, and these were perfectly ordinary explanations that would have satisfied almost anyone, but they did not satisfy him. One evening, at the table, with the small fan turning above them and the cicadas calling outside as they always called in late summer, he made a quiet decision that he would find out who the rider was. Behind the house, beyond the kitchen garden where his mother grew cucumbers and shiso and small green peppers, there stood a low wooden shed, used for tools and for storing the rice straw that the family kept for the winter. The shed had a small window facing the lane, and from inside, if he sat very still, he could see the gravel track without being seen himself, which made it, he thought, a perfectly suitable place to wait and watch. On the first night of his small investigation he took with him a flashlight, a thermos of barley tea, and a thin cotton blanket, and he settled himself on a folded sack of straw and waited for the hour to come. 10 o'clock arrived in the slow, gentle way that 10 o'clock arrives in the country, with the cicadas tapering off and the frogs in the ditch beginning their patient evening song, and on time, almost to the minute, the bike came. He heard it pass the corner of the shed, heard the soft change of gears as it began the slope, and he leaned forward to look, but the angle was wrong and he caught only the briefest blur of something dark moving among the trees. He told himself that when the bike returned he would be ready, that he would step out to the road and shine the flashlight directly upon the rider, and so he sat with the lamp in his hand, listening, breathing slowly. But the night was warm, and the straw was soft beneath him, and the small steady song of the frogs was the kind of sound that carries a tired person across the border of sleep without their noticing the crossing. He had, in fact, a small dream, of nothing particular, only of walking along a path he half knew, and when he opened his eyes again the sky outside the window was a deeper, quieter dark, and his watch said 4 in the morning. The bike, of course, had come and gone, and he had heard nothing, and he sat for a while in the cool stillness of the shed feeling the small embarrassment that comes of having tried hard and slept anyway. On the next day, more careful now, he set about a different plan, and being a clever boy with the long, patient inventiveness of country children, he began to gather what he needed from the cupboards and the tool shed. He took a length of fishing line, very fine, almost invisible in the dim light of dusk, and he stretched it tightly across the gravel track at about the height of an ankle, tying one end to a small clip that would tug a tin can if disturbed. He covered the line with a sprinkling of leaves and a careful scatter of pine needles so that even the rider, even with a headlamp burning, would not notice it until it caught against the front wheel and snapped clean. Beside the trip line he hid a small microphone, the kind sold for cheap at electronics shops in the nearest town, and he wired it to a transmitter that would carry the sound back to the radio he had set up inside the shed. He tested it twice in the late afternoon, walking up the lane and humming under his breath, and listening through the earphone of the radio as his own voice came back to him, faint but clear, across the small distance. That night, 10 o'clock arrived again, and the boy was determined that this time he would not sleep, that he would smoke a single cigarette borrowed from his older cousin and stay sharp and still and ready in the cool dark. For a long while there was only the soft breathing of the country in his ears, the breeze in the cedar tops, the small clicks and rustles of unseen creatures, the distant complaint of a far dog miles off across the valley. He found himself thinking, calmly and without alarm, that perhaps tonight the bike would simply not come, that perhaps the rider somehow knew when he was being watched, the way certain shy creatures know when a human eye is upon them. It was at that moment, on the very edge of another quiet thought, that the radio in his hand made a small clean sound, the bright little electronic chirp of the can being pulled and the line snapping free. A heartbeat behind it came the unmistakable noise of a motorbike engine, low and certain, and then the slightly rougher cough of a gear shift, the kind of sound a person who knew engines might recognize without thinking. He was on his feet at once, and he ran out across the kitchen garden and through the gap in the hedge, and out onto the gravel track, ready to meet the bike face on as it came down the slope toward him. The lane was empty. There was no rider, no machine, no taillight retreating into the dark, no glow of an engine cooling, only the small, ordinary night, with its small, ordinary stars, and the gravel track that sloped quietly into the trees. He walked to the place where he had stretched the fishing line, and he saw clearly that it had been broken, the two halves lying loose on the ground, the small clip tugged free, exactly as he had designed it to do. For a long while he stood there in the warm summer night, holding the radio, trying to fit what he had heard against what he was now seeing, and finding, gently and stubbornly, that the two would not match. When he returned to the shed his hand was steadier than he expected, and he sat down on the folded sack and rewound the small cassette he had been recording onto, all the way to the beginning of the night. He pressed play, and through the earphones he heard the long, soft silence of the woods, the same silence he had been listening to for hours, broken at last by the unmistakable approach of an engine drawing nearer along the lane. The sound was clear and ordinary, the sort of mechanical voice you might hear from any small bike in any country village, and then came the small bright snap of the line as it broke beneath the front tire. After the snap there was a pause, only a breath long, and then, threaded through the static like something that had always been there but had not yet been heard, came a voice, very low, very tired, almost lost in the air. The voice on the tape was a man's voice, hoarse, as if it had been used a great deal in the cold, and it began with a sound that was not quite a word, only a long, pained, drawn-out hum, the way a person might hum to himself if he were grieving and did not know he was being heard. Then the voice spoke a name, twice, calling it softly, the way a parent might call a child who had wandered too far in a department store, and the name it called was Maruko. The boy sat very still in the shed. The name was familiar to him only in the smallest way, the way a cousin's name spoken once at a New Year gathering might cling, faintly, somewhere at the back of the mind, and he could not, at that moment, place it. He carried the tape into the house in the early hours, with the dew already beginning to silver the grass, and he laid it on the low table in the front room and waited until his parents were awake and gathered. His father listened first, with the polite patience of a country man who does not interrupt, and as the voice on the tape began its slow, hoarse hum, the boy saw his father grow very still, the way a person grows still in the presence of whether they remember. His father said quietly that they should let the boy's grandmother hear it, and so a little later the small tape recorder was carried into the next room, and his grandmother, in her plain everyday clothes, sat on the floor and bent forward to listen. When the voice came, the old woman did not cry out, but tears began very quickly down her cheeks, and she pressed her hand against her mouth, and she said, after a long pause, that the voice was her husband's voice. She said that she had not heard him speak in many, many years, but the small particular sound at the start of his speaking, the long-drawn breath like a hum, had always been with him, and she would have known it anywhere. The story she told then was a quiet one, and the boy listened the way one listens to a story one has half always known without knowing it, the way a half-remembered tune is sometimes recognized only when it returns. His grandfather, in his younger years, had been a man of very ordinary kindness, and he and his wife had had several children, the youngest of whom was a small, quick-eyed girl whose name was Maruko. When Maruko was 8 years old, she had become ill, with a kind of sudden sickness that the country in those years did not yet have many ways to fight, and within a few short weeks she had quietly died. What had happened to her was sad, and the family carried that sadness in the gentle, unspoken way that country families carry such things, but his grandfather, his grandmother said, had not been able to set the sadness down. He had begun to drink, every evening, at first only a little and then more, and he had grown gradually unwell in his spirit, talking less to those around him and more to absences that the others in the house could not see. On a night not unlike the boy's own summer nights, his grandfather had taken his old motorbike from the shed at around 10 in the evening, had told his wife that he was going to fetch Maruko home, and had ridden up the gravel lane into the forest. He had not come back. His body had been found 2 days later in the ravine that runs along the eastern edge of the woods, where a stream falls hard against the rocks, and the people who found him said that he looked, finally, peaceful. All of this had happened a very long time before the boy was born, and his parents had chosen, gently and without fault, not to tell him, because there had seemed no useful place in his ordinary life for so old a sorrow. The grandmother held the small tape recorder in her hands as she spoke, the way one might hold a sleeping bird, with great care, as if a sudden movement might frighten something that was already, by then, very tired. The boy, listening, felt the fear that he had expected to feel, and felt also, beneath it, something softer, a kind of sorrow that did not belong to him personally and yet seemed to ask him to make a small space for it. For days afterward, the lane was empty at 10 o'clock, and the dog slept undisturbed under the eaves, and the boy lay in his room and listened to the wind in the cedars and heard nothing else. His parents took the tape, in the end, to an old woman in the next village who served as the keeper of the small shrine there, a woman with white hair and very calm hands, who had known the family for a long time. She listened to the tape in her own quiet way, and she did not say much, only that the grandfather had been calling for Maruko for a long time and had perhaps grown tired of calling and was looking, at last, for a place to rest. She took the tape into the small wooden hall behind the shrine, and she burned it slowly, with a few words spoken under her breath, and when she came back out she gave the boy a small wrap charm and said that he should keep it close. The boy kept it close, and he slept easily, and the summer ended, and the cicadas grew thin, and autumn came in the way autumn comes in the deep country, with the smell of wood smoke and the first cool nights. He never heard the motorbike again. He thought, sometimes, in later years, that perhaps his grandfather had finally come down from the trees, that the long search had at last come to its end, that Maruko had taken her father's hand and led him quietly home. He thought, too, that perhaps that was not the right way to think of it at all, and that the dead are simply somewhere we cannot follow, and that the sounds we sometimes catch from them are like distant weather, neither cruel nor kind, only there. The grandmother lived several years more, and on the evening before she herself died she asked the boy, who was by then almost a man, to sit with her, and she told him only that she was not afraid. She said that she had been listening, on quiet nights, for a long time, and that she had begun to feel that her husband was no longer wandering, that he was waiting, and that this was a kindness she had not expected. When she went gently, in the early morning, with the first light coming through the paper screens and laying its soft pale square across the tatami, and the house was very quiet for a long time afterward. The boy, grown by then, kept a single photograph of his grandfather, a stiff old picture from before any of this had happened, in which his grandfather was standing in his work clothes beside a young woman and a small girl with bright eyes. He kept the small charm from the shrine in a drawer, and on certain summer evenings, when he opened the drawer for some other reason, he would find himself thinking quietly of the gravel lane and the trees and the long slow hum at the start of a voice. The forest behind the old house is still there, and the lane is still there, narrowing away into the cedars, and somewhere among them, perhaps, a small girl named Maruko is still being met at last by the father who came so far to find her. And that, perhaps, is where this part of the story rests for tonight, with the dog asleep under the eaves, and the cicadas thinning toward silence, and the dark forest holding what it holds, gently, as old forests do. And so we leave that hallway behind, the soft echo of footsteps fading into the quiet, the light at its end growing smaller until it is only a memory pressed gently against the back of your eyelids. There is no need to follow any further tonight. You can let the corridor close, let the door drift shut on its own, and feel the warmth of the room you are actually in settle around your shoulders like a blanket folding itself slowly into place. Take a slow breath in, and a slower one out. Our next story takes us to a darker corner of the country, somewhere quieter, somewhere older, where the night listens a little more carefully. There is no rush at all. We will arrive when you are ready. By the time the third evening of October had folded itself over the city, the small thread on the message board had stopped feeling like idle conversation and had begun to feel more like a quiet room that none of its readers quite wanted to leave. Outside the windows of the apartments where those readers sat, Tokyo and the smaller towns around it were settling into a soft autumn night, the air carrying that faint mixture of damp pavement and distant cooking that always seemed to arrive when the season turned. In one room there was the low hum of a refrigerator, in another the muted laughter of a television left on for company, and in many of them the only steady glow came from the screen of a computer where a single browser tab had been open for hours. That tab held the thread, and the thread held the words of a man who said he had walked sideways out of his own life and woken up for days behind it. The readers had received his story with the polite skepticism that the board reserved for travelers and prophets, the kind of dry, weary tone that older posters used to soften the strange claims of strangers. Yet as the hours of the second night had crept toward the third, that tone had been thinning, the way frost thins on a window when warm breath is held too close to the glass. The man, who in their replies they had begun simply to call Ichi, had described his journey in language that was almost shy, almost apologetic, as if he were not quite sure that what had happened to him belonged to the public world at all. He had explained that the method, if one could call it that, had involved no instruments, no rituals, only the careful turning of attention before sleep toward a moment one wished to revisit. He had said that one was meant to think of that moment night after night, gently, the way one might think of a face one missed, until a dream finally arrived that did not behave like other dreams. That dream, he had said, would be brighter than memory and steadier than imagination, and within it one would slowly notice that the small details of the room around the dreaming self were beginning to assemble themselves into something coherent. When the assembly was complete, he had said, one would open one's eyes and find the date on the calendar quietly disagreeing with the date one had carried into bed. For him that disagreement had amounted to 4 days, and on the morning he had described, the digital clock by his pillow had read the 2nd of October, although he had gone to sleep on the 6th. The world that greeted him had been almost identical to the one he had left, but only almost, and it was the small almosts that he kept returning to in his messages. A shirt he did not remember buying had been folded inside his closet, the icons on his desktop had been arranged in a different order, and a piece of software he was certain he had installed was no longer there. He had written about these differences with a kind of careful patience, as though listing them aloud might help him decide whether to be frightened. The readers had teased him at first, in the gentle, clipped way the board preferred, calling his account a recycled story, telling him that they had grown tired of these tales of slipped time. A few had asked him for proof, and 1 or 2 had asked him for the lottery numbers, which was the oldest joke on a board where every claim of foresight was eventually tested against money. He had not given them numbers, because, he said, 3 days before the present he could not even remember most of what had been on the news, only the larger shapes of the week ahead. But he had offered them what he could remember, and that offering was the thing that, slowly and without any of them quite noticing the moment it happened, had begun to change the temperature of the thread. He had told them that on the 4th of October there would be an earthquake in the northeast, a tremor of around level 4, the sort of shake that rattles cups but does not break them. He had told them that on that same day, somewhere, a group of people would fall ill after eating together, a small outbreak of food poisoning at a place where many ate from the same kitchen. He had told them, in the most reluctant of his sentences, that he remembered a story about a father and a son and an act of violence committed with a wooden bat, and he had asked them to forgive him for not wanting to describe it more closely. He had told them that on the 5th, in some construction site he could not place precisely, a worker would be crushed beneath a panel of reinforced concrete, and he had said this in the tone of a man who had hoped never to repeat it. The readers had received these predictions in the way that readers receive most predictions on the internet, which is to say without much ceremony, half copying them into private notes and half mocking them in the next breath. One of them, however, had written a short reply that broke from the rest, a single line in which he said that he had recorded the predictions and that he intended, for his own quiet reasons, to believe. That single line had given the thread its center of gravity, the way one steady chair anchors a circle of restless ones, and after it the conversation had grown quieter and a little more attentive. For a day after that, Ichi did not write, and the thread had drifted in the slow way that threads drift when their main voice has stepped away from the keyboard. Readers came and went, leaving small comments and small jokes, and the timestamp stretched out into the kind of long, comfortable silences that boards develop when no one is in a hurry. The 3rd of October arrived, and the world arranged itself in the unremarkable way that days do, with morning trains and lunch breaks and the particular gold of afternoon light on apartment balconies. Then, late in the evening, one of the readers posted a brief news item, almost in passing, almost as if he did not want anyone to make too much of it, mentioning that there had been a tremor of around level 4, somewhere in the northeast, earlier that day. The date did not match perfectly, the location was a degree off, and several voices in the thread were quick to point out that small earthquakes were common at that time of year and that one could find them on almost any week of the calendar. A few of the older posters laughed gently at the others for being moved by such a thing coincidence, and one of them, in the fond, scolding voice that older posters often use, told the believers that they were letting their imaginations dress in costumes again. The believers did not argue back loudly, but they did not leave either, and the thread carried itself softly into the next night with that quiet, attentive feeling intact. On the 4th of October, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary afternoon, another reader posted a link, and below it he wrote only that this was the one, and that he was not sure what to do with himself for having read it. The article said that at a middle school in a coastal town, 84 students had complained of stomach pain after their school lunch, and that the cafeteria was being investigated as a possible source. The thread paused, in the way that threads pause when something has happened that no one had quite been prepared to face, and for several minutes there were no new replies at all. When the replies began again, they were shorter than usual, and they had lost most of their earlier mockery, and many of them were simply expressions of unease in the small, polite vocabulary that readers reach for when they do not yet have the words they want. One reader noted that the prediction had spoken of food poisoning, and that here was food poisoning, on the very day named, and that the coincidence, while not impossible, had begun to feel uncomfortably specific. Another, in the quiet voice that some posters used when they were trying not to alarm themselves, asked whether they should now expect the rest of the predictions to come true in their proper order. A third, more cautious, reminded everyone that there were still several names on the list, and that some of the predicted events would, if they were honest, be unkind to read about, and that perhaps they should hope this was where the pattern broke. It did not break. As the evening of the 4th gave way to the morning of the 5th, more news began to arrive, not all at once but in a slow, dripping rhythm that felt almost respectful in its restraint. A piece of reinforced concrete had fallen at a worksite, and a person had been pinned beneath it, and the report concluded with the small, hard sentence that the worker had not survived. In a different prefecture, the police had detained a man on suspicion of having harmed his own father, and the readers, when they read the article, looked away from their screens for a moment before returning to type. Up in the north, the ground had moved again, this time more strongly, and the early reports placed the magnitude near 5, a number large enough to wake people from afternoon naps. In another city a girl had been found in a place she should not have been kept, in a story of confinement that the readers chose to summarize gently rather than to detail, because the thread had become a place where gentleness mattered. Out at sea, a typhoon was strengthening as it moved north, the forecasters pointing arrows along the eastern coastline, and the maps on the evening news were filling with the curling shapes that meant the country should prepare itself. One reader assembled all of these items into a single post, lining them up like beads on a thread, and below them he placed the original list that Ichi had written, and the two columns leaned toward each other with an uncomfortable closeness. The dates were not exact, the places were not always the places he had named, the magnitudes wandered by half a step, and the details, where they could be checked, were never quite a match. Yet the shapes were there, the same shapes, in the same order, and the readers, looking at the columns, felt something that was less like fear and more like the particular hush that arrives in a room when a clock that had been silent for years suddenly begins to tick. The man who had once written that he intended, for his own quiet reasons, to believe, returned to the thread and wrote a single short line in which he said only that he was glad he had kept the notes. Through all of this, Ichi himself did not appear. His handle did not light up beside any of the new posts, and the small green dot that some boards used to indicate present stayed dim against his name. The readers noticed, at first in passing, then more openly, and as the 6th of October arrived they began to write to him as one writes to someone who has stepped briefly out of a room and is expected to return. They asked him whether he had seen the news, and they apologized, in their indirect way, for having teased him, and they invited him to come back and tell them what he was feeling now that the world had begun to behave the way he had said it would. He did not answer. The hours went past, the time stamps lengthened, and the thread, which had grown so quiet, began to feel less like a room with someone temporarily absent and more like a room from which someone had already left. Late on the 6th, one of the readers, a person who had been mostly silent until then, wrote a long and careful post, and in it he proposed an idea that felt, even as he wrote it, like the kind of idea one should be careful of speaking aloud. He reminded the others that Ichi had described his first leap as having taken place on the night of the 6th of October, when he had gone to sleep at his usual hour, in front of a television, sitting in the loose, cross-legged way that tired people sometimes sit. He suggested, in a tone that was more thoughtful and dramatic, that perhaps Ichi had reached that same hour in this new world without realizing it, and had performed the same motion of attention before sleep that he had once performed before, simply because his body remembered. And if he had performed it again, the reader continued, then perhaps he had moved sideways once more, into another 2nd of October, in another almost identical world, where another version of the thread was being read by another circle of strangers. Perhaps, the reader said, he was now living the same week again, with the same small differences, the same shirt that he did not remember buying, the same icons rearranged on a desktop he had not touched. Perhaps each time he reached the 6th, he slept, and slipped, and began once more, and perhaps the version of him who had spoken to them was already several worlds behind, and the version who would speak to the next thread had not yet been born into his loop. The thought settled over the thread the way snow settles, soft at first, then heavier, until the readers found themselves quiet beneath it. One of them wrote, with the gentle mock bravery that the board sometimes used to push back against feelings it did not want to name, that he had grown tired of this world and would be retiring to another, and the small joke was received kindly even though no one quite laughed. Another wrote, in the careful, slightly clumsy phrasing of someone who had not posted before, that he hoped Ichi was being treated kindly wherever he was, and that he was sorry for not having believed him sooner. A third, simply, said good night. The thread did not formally end, in the way that threads on that kind of board so rarely formally end, but the new posts grew further apart, and then further apart again, and in time the page slipped down and away from the front, into the long, quiet archive where so much of the internet eventually goes to rest. Years later, readers would still find the thread, and they would read it slowly, the way one reads an old letter found in a drawer, and they would feel the same hush that the original readers had felt, although they would not always be able to say why. Some of them would conclude, sensibly, that the whole thing had been a careful piece of fiction written by a thoughtful stranger who had a fondness for the kind of stories where time bends gently, and who had picked his predictions from the shapes of the news he expected to see. Others would conclude, less sensibly perhaps, that something genuine had happened to a quiet man on a quiet night, and that he had reached out to strangers in the only way he knew how, and that the strangers had at least done him the kindness of writing his predictions down. Still others would not conclude anything at all, and would simply close the tab when they had finished reading, and would turn their faces toward the windows of their own rooms, and would notice the way the lights of the city softened at that hour, and the way the air smelled faintly of damp pavement and distant cooking. They would think, in the loose, drifting way one thinks before sleep, of how strange it would be to wake one morning and find that a shirt one did not remember was folded in one's closet, and that the icons on one's screen were arranged in a slightly different order, and that everyone around one was carrying on as though nothing at all had moved. They would think of how easy it would be, in such a world, to mistake oneself for the only one who had noticed. And they would think, as their own eyes began to grow heavy, of the man who had once written a few short lines into a quiet thread on a quiet board, and who had then gone to bed at his usual hour, and who had perhaps simply turned the small key of his attention before sleep, in the way he had turned it once before, without meaning to turn it again. Whether he is still turning it now, somewhere along a soft chain of almost identical Octobers, no one in this world can say. The thread, when one finds it, is gentle with him, and the readers within it, even at their most uncertain, kept their voices low for his sake, the way one keeps one's voice low in a room where someone is sleeping. Perhaps that is the kindest answer one can offer to a story like his, and perhaps it is the truest, and perhaps it is enough for tonight. And so the thread rests, and the predictions rest, and the man who wrote them rests, in whatever quiet October he has wandered into, and we, listening here, may rest as well, with the soft assurance that some questions are not ours to answer, and that the night, in its patient way, will hold them safely until morning. And so we leave that hallway behind, the soft creak of its floorboards fading into memory, the shapes within its dim corners settling back into stillness as though they had only ever been a passing breath upon the quiet of the night. There is no need to carry any of it with you now. Let your shoulders sink a little deeper into the warmth around you, and take one slow breath in, and one even slower breath out. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, where the lamps burn low and the kettle has long since cooled, and there is nothing left to do but listen, gently, as the words drift in. The last weeks of his old life passed for him in the kind of soft, watery quiet that follows a long fever, when the worst has gone and yet the body remembers everything, and he found himself moving through his small Tokyo apartment as though through someone else's home. He had begun, very slowly, the work of letting things go, lifting each object and asking it without words whether it would travel with him to the new country, or whether it belonged here in the city where he had loved and lost and gone on living anyway. He kept very few things, in the end, and the rooms grew lighter as he packed, the futon folded smaller than he remembered, the kettle wiped and given to a younger neighbor, the framed photograph of his daughter at 7 years old wrapped in soft paper and placed gently into a box bound for a storage room he would probably never visit again. Outside, late spring rain fell across the city in long, even sheets, and the smell of wet pavement and warm asphalt drifted through the half-open window, and somewhere far below a streetcar bell rang once, twice, and then was lost in the hush of traffic. He had told no one he was leaving, except for the bank that handled his small portfolio, and a kind older man at the investment office who had known him for many years and had not asked any of the painful questions. The decision to move abroad had not arrived all at once, the way these decisions are sometimes shown in stories, but had built itself quietly over many months, the way frost gathers on a window in winter, until one morning he woke and understood that his staying here had become, in some still way, a refusal to live. He had chosen a small coastal town in a country far from Japan, a place where the language would be unfamiliar enough that he could rest inside it, where no neighbor would know the name of his wife, and no waiter would remember his daughter's birthday. He thought, sometimes, while folding clothes or rinsing a single rice bowl, that what he wanted was not so much escape as silence, the kind of silence that holds a person rather than empties them, the long, ordinary silence of a place that has no expectation of him. It was on a Thursday, he would remember later, that his daughter came to the door for the last time. The rain had thinned to mist by then, and the late afternoon light through the kitchen curtains was pale and bluish, and the apartment smelled faintly of green tea gone cold and the lavender soap he had begun to use because it reminded him of nothing at all. He heard the elevator settle on his floor, and then her footsteps, hesitant in a way they had not been since she was a small girl, and he understood, even before she knocked, who was standing on the other side of the door. He opened it because he had decided, some time ago, that he would not lock himself away from her physically, even if his heart had quietly closed. He had come to believe that doors were not the same as feelings, and he wanted the difference to remain. She had been crying for some time before she arrived, he could tell, and her face was very pale, and her hair, usually so carefully arranged, was loose and rain-touched, and she was holding a thin envelope in both hands as though it might fall apart if she relaxed her grip. He showed her in without speaking, and she took off her shoes in the small genkan, the entry step, and stepped onto the tatami, and the soft give of the mat under her stockinged feet made a small dry sound that he had loved, once, when she was a child running home from school. He poured her tea, because that was what one did, even now, even here, and he put before her a small plate with 2 rice crackers, and he sat opposite her at the low table and waited, the way a person waits at the edge of a pond for the water to settle. She told him, in a voice that kept catching on itself, that her own daughter, the granddaughter he had seen only once across the bright air of a restaurant, had become very ill. She said that the illness was in the blood, and that the doctors had searched the registry for many weeks, and that out of the great quiet ocean of donors in Japan, his name alone had returned, a match so improbable that the consultant had asked twice whether the records were correct. She told him that she had not wanted to come, and yet had not been able to stay away, and she said this looking down at the table, at the place where the tea was cooling in its small cup, as though the table itself might know what to say to him. She placed the envelope between them, and inside, he understood without opening it, would be the medical letters, the consent forms, the schedule of small needles and small rooms, the careful infrastructure of saving a child. He listened to her without moving, and he watched, with a strange distant tenderness, the way her shoulders trembled inside her coat, and he thought, in a corner of himself that had nothing more to lose, that she had grown into a woman who knew, finally, what it felt like to ask. She lowered herself, then, all the way to the floor, the way one does when language fails, her forehead nearly touching the tatami, and she begged him quietly, the way a person begs a season to last, asking him to help her child. He did not lift her up, and he did not turn away, and he did not, in that long moment, feel the rush of feeling he had once expected from himself. He felt instead a great, even calm, the kind of calm that comes after weather. He told her only that he would think about it, and that she should go home now, and that she should hold her daughter and let her daughter sleep, and that the night ahead would be long for her either way. When she had gone, the room held the faint scent of rain and her perfume, and the teacup sat untouched on the low table, and he sat for a long while looking at the place where her forehead had rested on the mat. He thought about his wife, then, not as he had thought of her in the angry years, but as she had been in their first apartment, very young, her hair shorter, laughing about something small in the kitchen, and he felt no bitterness about the memory, only the quiet ache of a song one used to know. He thought about his daughter at 5, climbing onto his lap on a cold evening, demanding to be told the story of the moon rabbit one more time, her small hands warm against his sleeve, and the memory came to him not as accusation but as fact, as something that had once been true and was true still. He understood, sitting there with the light moving slowly across the tatami, that he was a man who had been hurt very deeply, and that he was also a man who had been loved, once, very simply, and that both of these things could be true without cancelling each other. He did not, that evening, decide what he would do. He made a small dinner of rice and grilled fish and miso soup, the way he had learned to make it for himself in the years after his wife had gone, and he ate it slowly, and he washed the single bowl, and he turned out the kitchen light. The next morning he took the train to Haneda, his small suitcase rolling behind him, and the city slid past the windows in the soft grey of a clearing sky, and the announcements played their gentle chime at every station the way they always had, the way they would after he was gone. He had booked a room in one of the airport hotels, because his flight was not until late the following night, and he had wanted, for one last evening, to stand at a high window and look at his country. The hotel room was very plain and very clean, and the curtains were the soft white of hospital sheets, and the bed had been turned down with a small chocolate placed neatly on the pillow, and the kettle on the desk gave its quiet click as the water reached the boil. He stood at the window for a long time, watching the runways, watching the slow patient choreography of the planes, the small trucks moving like beetles between them, the lights coming on one by one as the dusk thickened. He thought of all the years he had spent looking for his wife, the small offices of the private investigators, the long evenings with a printout of her last known route, the cigarette he had let himself smoke only when the search felt unbearable, and how all of that searching, in the end, had returned to him a stranger. He thought of the restaurant where, years before, a kind waiter had spoken to him in a low voice about a family who came every spring to celebrate a daughter's birthday, and he remembered how he had walked out into the street that day and crossed at the signal, and how, somewhere behind him, his daughter had called out for him in a voice he had chosen not to answer. He had never spoken of any of this to anyone, and he understood, looking out at the runway lights, that he probably never would, and that there was a kind of dignity in carrying a story alone, when the story was finally one's own. He thought of his granddaughter, whom he had seen only at a distance, a small bright child with her mother's mouth, and he allowed himself, for the first time, to imagine her in a hospital room, asleep under a thin white blanket, attended by quiet machines. He felt no rush of decision, and yet he felt something move in him, the way an old door, long stuck, might move a little when pressed without anger. He did not know, that night, whether he would board his flight, or whether he would call the hospital in the morning, or whether he would do both, or neither. He understood only that the decision was his to make slowly, in a room of his own, with no one watching him, and that the long search of his life, the search he had thought was for his wife, had turned out, all along, to be a search for the small still place where he could choose freely, without the past pulling at his sleeve. He turned from the window after a while, and he ran a bath, and he soaked in the small hotel tub with his eyes closed, and the water held him the way water always had, without condition, without memory. He thought, drowsily, that the body is a kind country, faithful in its small ways, breathing whether one asks it to or not, warming when given warmth. He thought of his old apartment, already empty, and of the neighbor woman who would water the single plant he had left on the balcony for a few weeks before deciding what to do with it. He thought of the trains running their last circuits of the night across the city, the carriages mostly empty now, the conductors quiet, the announcement softer at this hour. He climbed out of the bath and dried himself, and he put on the soft cotton yukata, the light robe the hotel had folded on the bed, and he sat at the small desk by the window with a sheet of hotel paper in front of him. He did not write, that night, the letter he had thought he would write, the one about the years of betrayal and the careful detail of what had been done to him. He wrote, instead, only a few small lines, in his careful schoolteacher's hand, addressed to no one in particular, lines about the way the city had looked from the hotel window, about the planes, about a kettle clicking off in a quiet room. He left the page on the desk under the small lamp, and he did not seal it, and he did not name a recipient, and he turned the lamp out. Outside, the runway lights blinked on through the night, gentle and slow, and somewhere across the bay a foghorn sounded once, very softly, the way the world sometimes acknowledges itself. He lay on the cool hotel bed with the curtain drawn back a hand's width, and he watched the faint blue light moving on the ceiling, and he listened to the hum of the building, the small ducted breath of the air, the distant sigh of an aircraft taking off. He found himself thinking, with no particular urgency, that mercy is not always a feeling. He thought that mercy can be, sometimes, only a small movement of the hand, a phone call placed at a reasonable hour, a name signed on a consent form, a body lying still while a small needle does its slow good work. He thought that one does not have to forgive, in the large and shining sense, in order to be the person, in some small and bony way, who chooses not to let a child go. He did not know which it would be, and the not knowing did not pain him as it once would have, and he was grateful, in a tired and faraway way, for that small grace. Sleep came toward him then, the way it comes to a man who has been carrying a heavy bag for many miles and has finally set it down on a clean wooden bench at the edge of a station platform. He thought of his wife, very young, in their first apartment, laughing about a kettle that would not whistle, and he let the memory be what it had always been, before the years had complicated it, and he did not try to hold it, and he did not try to send it away. He thought of the granddaughter he had seen only once, and he did not know her face well, and yet he found her face arranging itself in his mind anyway, the way faces do when they are needed. Somewhere below, a luggage cart rolled across the tile of the lobby, a small passing percussion, and somewhere above, an airplane crossed the night sky with its small green light, bound for a city whose name he would not have to learn. He thought, just before sleep took him fully, that the story of his life had not ended at the restaurant where he had walked out into the rain, and had not ended at the door where his daughter had bowed her forehead to the tatami, and had not ended in any of the rooms he had once expected an ending to find him. He thought that perhaps stories of this kind do not end so much as quiet, the way a long bell quiets in the high beams of a temple, the way a kettle quiets after the flame is turned down. He thought, as the room dimmed inside him, that he was, after everything, still here, still breathing, still capable of a small kindness or a small rest, and that this was a great deal more than he had once believed he would have. He would decide in the morning, or he would not, and the morning would come either way, the soft grey light moving across the runway and across the curtains and across his face, and the world would receive whatever choice he made the way the world always does, without praise and without blame. For now, the night held him, and the city he was leaving held him, and the long, complicated love he had once had for his family held him at a distance that was, at last, bearable. For now, the small hotel room with its plain white curtains and its silent kettle was enough, and the runway lights blinking blue on the ceiling were enough, and the slow rise and fall of his own breath was enough. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, with a man at a high window above an airport, neither departing nor returning, only resting, only breathing, only allowing himself, after a very long time, to be quietly held. Sleep well, traveler, wherever your night finds you. And so we leave that hallway behind, the soft echo of footsteps fading into the quiet, the doors closing one by one until only the hush remains. There is no need to follow any further. You may rest here a moment, just where you are, letting the weight of the last story settle somewhere far below your shoulders. Breathe in slowly, gently, and let the breath out even more slowly than it came. Nothing is asked of you now. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, somewhere across a still evening, where a single lamp is burning low in a window and the rooms are folding themselves into sleep. Take your time. We will arrive there together, unhurried, drifting in like the softest tide. The seventh part of our long evening together begins in a small apartment on the edge of a Tokyo suburb, where the late summer rain has been falling very softly against the window since just after dusk. The room is the kind of room you may have known yourself, in some other country and some other life, with thin curtains the color of old paper, and a low table that has been polished so often it has begun to wear smooth at the corners. On the floor there is a faded tatami mat, slightly cool against the soles of bare feet, releasing that gentle, almost grassy smell that tatami releases in the evening when the day's heat begins to leave the room. A kettle is set on a small electric ring in the kitchen alcove, and it is not yet boiling, only beginning to sigh, the kind of sound that a house makes when it is not quite ready for sleep but very nearly so. The woman who lives in this apartment is, by her own quiet accounting, somewhere in her later 50s, and she has been a mother for almost 3 decades, and she is, on this particular rainy night, waiting for her grown daughter to arrive. She had not, at first, been certain she wanted her daughter to come at all, and in fact she had thought, earlier in the day, of pretending to be out, of leaving the lights off and sitting very still in the back room until the visit had passed. But she had decided, in the end, to open the door, because there are some doors, she had come to understand over the past 2 years, that you do not get to keep closed forever. To begin to tell this story properly, we must move backward a little, the way memory itself moves, drifting first sideways and then slowly down through the layers of the years. The mother in our story had grown up in a household where words were used the way some people use small stones, picked up easily and thrown without much thought, and she had assumed, in the way that children often do, that this was simply how a family spoke. When her own daughter was born, on a cold morning in early spring, she had held the small, warm bundle in her arms and felt something she did not have a precise word for, a soft kind of weight that pressed against her ribs and made her promise, silently, that she would do better than her own mother had done. And yet, as the years went on, and the daughter became first a toddler, and then a schoolchild, and then a quiet teenager with a heavy school bag and a long fringe of black hair, the words began to come out of the mother's mouth almost without her permission. She would say, when the daughter spilled her miso soup, that the daughter was clumsy and useless, and that she did not know why she had bothered cooking at all. She would say, when the daughter brought home a test paper that was less than perfect, that the daughter had a face she could not stand to look at, and a brain that did not deserve the rice it was fed. The apartment from those years was a slightly larger one than this current one, a third-floor place with a balcony that faced a row of cherry trees, and it is the room from those years that the mother now finds herself remembering most often, late at night, when she cannot sleep. She remembers the way the light from the kitchen would fall in a long pale rectangle across the wooden floor of the living room, and how her daughter, very small at the time, would sit just at the edge of that light, almost but not quite inside it. She remembers a particular evening, in the daughter's first year of elementary school, when the daughter had given her a small folded paper crane, made carefully from a sheet of flyer paper, and had said, in a voice no louder than a moth, that this was a present. And she remembers, with a clarity she would prefer not to have, that she had glanced at the crane, and laughed once, and said that the daughter had no sense of design, and that it was a useless thing, and that she did not know why the daughter had bothered. She does not remember what happened to the crane after that, only that it disappeared from the table sometime later, and that the daughter had not made another one, not while she was a child. There were many such evenings, stacked one upon another like the layers of an old futon, each one perhaps not heavy on its own, but together producing a weight that a small body would not have been able to lift. The husband, the daughter's father, was usually present in another room during these moments, reading the newspaper or watching the baseball, and he would sometimes look up and frown softly, but he would rarely speak. The mother had told herself, at the time, that what she was doing was a kind of training, a sort of strict love that the world would eventually require of her daughter, and that the daughter would, when she was older, come to understand and even to thank her for. She had also told herself, more quietly, that her own mother had spoken to her in this same way, and that she had survived, and that surviving was, perhaps, all that any parent could really hope to teach. The daughter grew, in the way that all daughters grow, sometimes slowly and sometimes in sudden surprising bursts, and the mother did not always notice when something inside the daughter began to go still. There came a stretch of years, somewhere around the daughter's middle school time, during which she stopped offering paper cranes, and stopped asking for help with her homework, and stopped saying very much at all over breakfast. The mother had taken this quietness for moodiness, the ordinary moodiness of teenage girls, and she had not looked closely enough to see that it was, in fact, the careful folding away of 1,000 small wounds into a place that the mother could no longer reach. After high school, the daughter went to a small college in another part of the country, and after college she found a job, and after a year or two she moved into her own small apartment, and she began, in the gentle way of grown children, to build a life that did not require her mother in it. The mother had assumed, during this period, that things were as they had always been, and that her daughter would call her on the appropriate holidays, and that the long history of small unkindnesses had been quietly, mercifully, forgotten. It was on a particular afternoon, about 2 years before the rainy night of our story, that the daughter had come to visit, and had sat down at the low table with her hands folded neatly in her lap, and had said, very calmly, that she had decided to begin taking her revenge. The mother remembers that the kettle had been boiling at the time, and that she had gotten up to attend to it, and that her hands had not, at first, understood what her ears had just heard. She had asked the daughter what she meant, and the daughter had only smiled, in a way that was not unkind, exactly, but that was somehow more frightening than any harsh expression would have been, and had said that the mother would understand soon enough. The visits, after that, took on a particular shape, and a particular rhythm, and the mother began to dread them, and at the same time to feel that she did not have the right to refuse them. The daughter would arrive, always politely, and always carrying a small gift such as a box of sweets or a packet of tea, and she would sit down at the low table and accept whatever was offered, and the conversation would begin in the ordinary way. And then, somewhere in the middle of an unremarkable sentence about the weather or about a shared acquaintance, the daughter would let fall a single sharp remark, very quietly, the way one might drop a coin onto a stone floor. She might say, for example, that there ought to be a law allowing children to dispose of their elderly parents, and she might say it with a small tilt of the head, almost cheerfully, as if she were proposing a new flavor of ice cream. She might glance at the mother's clothes and remark that the mother was not embarrassed to leave the house dressed in such a way, and she might add that she could not understand how a woman who did not even work for a living could justify eating 3 meals a day. She might wonder aloud, in a tone of mild academic curiosity, why people who earned no money and contributed nothing should continue to exist at all. And the mother, sitting across the low table with her hands very still in her lap, would feel each of these small sentences land somewhere just beneath her collarbone, and she would not, she found, be able to think of anything to say. After a moment, the daughter would smile again, and she would say, in a soft voice, that she had startled her mother, and that she had only been imitating the mother of long ago, and that of course she did not really mean any of it. Hearing that quiet explanation was, the mother came to understand, the worst part of all, because it meant that every cruel sentence the daughter spoke was, in fact, a sentence the mother herself had once spoken, returned to her after a long journey, only slightly changed by the years of waiting. There was the evening at the family restaurant, the small one near the train station with the bright menus and the plastic models of food in the front window, when the daughter had stood up only minutes after sitting down and had walked out without a word. The waiter had come, and had stood there with his small notepad, and the mother had had to explain, with a quiet smile, that her daughter was not feeling well, and that it would only be the two of them eating that night. Later, in the car, the daughter had returned, and had buckled her seat belt, and had said, very pleasantly, that she remembered the time she had used her very first paycheck to take her parents to dinner, and that her mother had stood up and walked out and left her sitting alone with the menu in her hands. The mother, who had not, until that moment, remembered the incident at all, found that she remembered it now with painful, perfect clarity, including the color of the tablecloth and the small hopeful expression on her daughter's face. There was the birthday on which the daughter had brought a wrapped gift, a soft scarf in a careful shade of grey, and the mother, opening it, had begun to say that it was lovely, only to discover, halfway through the sentence, that it was being snatched away. The daughter had said that the scarf had no taste, and that it would not suit her mother at all, and she had dropped it onto the floor in a small heap, and then, almost at once, she had picked it back up, and brushed it carefully with her hand, and said that of course she was only pretending, and that she hoped her mother would enjoy it. There was the night the daughter had stayed over in the spare room, and had come, very quietly, into her parents' bedroom in the dark, and had taken the heavy futon from the bed and carried it out to the balcony, and dropped it down into the rainy courtyard below. The mother, waking, had found a spare quilt in the closet, and had slept under it without complaint, and in the morning the daughter had said, gently, that it was fortunate there had been a spare, because when she had been a small girl, on a winter night, there had not been one for her. The mother had no memory of that winter night, but she did not doubt the story, and she did not ask for the details, because she had begun, by then, to understand that the details would not have changed anything. There were smaller things too, accumulating like dust in the corners of a quiet room, comments about the mother's friends, glances at the mother's tears, soft observations that the mother was being a tragic heroine, that she ought, perhaps, to step out of the room for a while if she was going to cry. Each remark would be followed by the same gentle phrase, that this had only been an imitation of an old version of the mother, and that the daughter herself, of course, would never speak in such a way. The husband, the daughter's father, had tried, on one occasion, to intervene, and had asked the daughter to please be kinder, and the daughter had nodded thoughtfully, and had said that she would, in future, save these particular conversations for the times when her father was not at home. After that, the husband had said very little, and the mother had not asked him to say more, because she was beginning to suspect that he had, in his own quiet way, been waiting a long time for someone to say these things, even if he did not approve of how they were being said. Sometimes the mother thought of refusing to open the door when the daughter rang the bell, and once or twice she had tried, and had simply sat very still in the back room with the lights off, the way she had thought of doing on the rainy night of our story. But the daughter had begun, on those occasions, to bring along a mutual acquaintance, an old family friend or a distant cousin, who would smile warmly through the doorway and say what a kind, attentive young woman the daughter had become, always coming to check on her aging parents. And the mother, smiling thinly, would have no choice but to open the door wider, because the alternative would have been to explain, in front of company, the long and tangled history that had led them to this exact afternoon. She had thought, more than once, of begging the daughter to simply cut all ties, to walk away forever and let them both have their separate silences, but she did not, in the end, ever ask for that, because she suspected that asking might give the daughter one more thing to gently mimic. And so we return now to the small apartment, and to the rainy evening, and to the kettle that has finally finished sighing on its small electric ring. The doorbell sounds once, a soft chime, and the mother stands, and smooths the front of her cardigan, and walks the few steps from the tatami room to the entryway, where the umbrellas are leaning together against the wall. Her daughter is there, in a long grey coat that is faintly shining with rain, and she is holding a small bag of senbei, the toasted rice crackers that are, the mother has long known, her daughter's favorite, and also her own. The daughter steps out of her shoes carefully, lining them up on the wooden step the way she was once taught to do, and she follows her mother into the small sitting room, and she sits down at the low table with her hands folded neatly in her lap. The mother pours the tea, and sets one cup in front of her daughter, and sits down across from her, and for a long moment neither of them speaks, and the only sound is the faint hush of the rain on the apartment window. The mother thinks, as she watches her daughter raise the cup to her lips, that she has been a great many things in her life that she had not intended to be, and that she has spoken a great many words she would now, if she could, fold back into her mouth like paper cranes returning to their flat sheets. She thinks that there are forms of harm that no apology can undo, and she thinks, also, that this does not relieve a person of the duty of apologizing, only of the right to expect anything in return. She had read once, in a small book she could no longer remember the name of, that the work of being forgiven is mostly the work of becoming, very slowly and over many years, a person who is no longer doing the thing that needed to be forgiven. She is not sure if she has yet become such a person, but she finds, on this rainy night, that she is willing at least to try, and that this willingness is its own small, quiet beginning. The daughter sets the cup down, and looks across the table at her mother, and the mother sees, for the first time in a long time, that her daughter looks tired, the way a person looks when they have been carrying something heavy for a great many more years than anyone has noticed. The daughter does not say anything cruel that evening, and she does not say anything kind either, and they sit together for an hour or so, drinking tea, and listening to the rain, and watching the steam curl gently up from the cups. When it is time to go, the daughter stands, and bows very slightly, in the small formal way she has always bowed since she was a child, and she puts on her shoes again at the entryway, and she steps out into the soft, continuing rain. The mother stands in the doorway and watches her daughter walk away down the wet street, beneath the orange glow of a single street lamp, until the long grey coat blurs into the darkness and the sound of her footsteps is lost in the sound of the rain. Then she closes the door, very gently, and she turns out the light in the entryway, and she walks back into the small tatami room, where the cups are still warm and the tea has gone the color of evening. She does not yet know whether her daughter will forgive her, or whether the long imitation will continue, or whether some new and quieter season is beginning between them, and she has begun to understand that she is not the one who gets to decide. She knows only that the rain is still falling, and that the apartment is quiet, and that somewhere in the city her daughter is walking home through the wet streets carrying an old and heavy thing, and that this, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight. And so we leave that hallway behind, the soft echo of footsteps fading into the quiet behind your eyes, the old house settling once more into its long, patient sleep. There is no need to follow it any further tonight. Let your shoulders ease into the pillow, let your breath grow a little slower, a little deeper, like a tide drawing back from the shore. You are safe here, exactly where you are. Our next story takes us to a darker corner of the country, somewhere colder, somewhere quieter still, where the wind moves differently through the trees. But there is no rush to arrive. Rest a moment longer, and let the next chapter find you gently, in its own time. Tonight, as the rest of the world settles into its small late hours, we travel a slow rail line through the countryside of Japan, where the platforms are unlit and the level crossings hum to themselves in the dark. The story belongs to a man who lived a life so ordinary that, when he later tried to describe it, he could only say he was the kind of person who took the same train, in the same direction, at the same unremarkable hour, almost every weekday of his adult years. He worked in a small office about 30 minutes from his home, and because the line was rural and the carriages rarely full, he had grown used to a kind of luxury that city commuters could not quite imagine, the simple ease of always finding a seat. He liked the morning version of that ride best, when the rice paddies passed by in soft green sheets and the sun lifted slowly behind the low hills, and he liked the evening version too, when the same fields turned the color of weak tea under a fading sky. On the night that this story remembers, he had stayed later than usual in town, because his department head had invited him out for drinks, and one cannot easily refuse such an invitation in a Japanese office, even when one is tired and quietly longing for home. They had gone to a small izakaya on a side street, a place with paper lanterns at the door and warm wooden counters, and the conversation had drifted from work to whether to old colleagues, in the soft, harmless way that office talk often does. He had drunk a little more than he meant to, as one often does on those evenings, and when he finally looked at his watch he saw with mild alarm that it was almost midnight, and that the very last train, the Shuden, would leave in only a few minutes. He hurried out into the cool air, half running, his coat folded over one arm, the small pleasant burn of warmth still in his chest from the sake, and he reached the platform just as the train hissed to a halt and the doors slid open with their familiar tired sigh. He thought, with a quiet small relief, that a taxi all the way home would have cost him close to 10,000 yen, more than he wished to spend on a thoughtless evening, and so he stepped on board and let the doors close softly behind him. The carriage he chose was empty in the gentle, complete way that only late country trains are empty, with rows of fabric seats stretching off in both directions, and the long fluorescent lights humming above his head as if the train itself were murmuring to keep him company. He sank into a 4-seat compartment near the middle of the car, stretched his legs out across to the seat opposite, and let his shoulders settle against the worn upholstery, and within a minute or two he found that his eyes were already closing of their own accord. The train began to move, and the small mechanical rocking, the kind that has lulled travelers to sleep for as long as railways have existed, began its quiet, patient work upon him, until he drifted into a half-doze that was neither sleep nor waking. He could not say, afterwards, how many minutes had passed, only that he was eventually drawn upward toward awareness by the sound of voices, soft voices, very near him, the kind of murmur a parent uses when speaking gently to a small child late at night. He listened without opening his eyes, the way one listens to rain on a roof, and he understood that the voices belonged to a young mother and a little boy, and that they were laughing in the warm, hushed way that families laugh when they think no one else is around. The mother was telling the child that he had always loved trains, that this train in particular was one of his favorites, and the child, whom she called Kenchan, was answering in the bright, unguarded voice of a boy not yet old enough to be tired by the hour. They spoke of a station they had visited together once, somewhere along this very line, and how much fun it had been, and the mother said in a soft, slightly wistful voice that she had hoped one day to take him to Tokyo Station, or to one of the great old Kokutetsu hubs. The word Kokutetsu, which means the old national railway, sat oddly in the man's mind as he listened, because the system had been renamed Junior more than 15 years before, and few people now used the older word, except perhaps elderly travelers remembering their youth. He thought, in the slow drift of his half-sleep, that they must have boarded at some quiet station while he was dozing, and that they were sitting in the row of seats just behind his own, hidden from him by the high seat backs. There was something almost soothing in the conversation, a domestic warmth, a mother and a child speaking of small joys and small wishes, and so he let his head settle back again and his thoughts grow loose, until the train slowed for the next stop and roused him properly. He sat up, blinking against the brightness of the carriage lights, and looked behind him along the row of seats, expecting to see a young woman with a sleepy boy on her lap, perhaps unwrapping a sweet, perhaps reading a small picture book. But the seats behind him were empty, every one of them, all the way to the far end of the carriage, where the door to the next car stood quietly closed, and the only movement was the soft rocking of empty straps swaying with the brakes. He thought, of course, that he had been dreaming, that the half-sleep of a tired commuter is full of small phantom voices, and that the warmth of the sake had given those voices the gentle texture of memory, and so he allowed himself a small embarrassed smile. The doors opened and closed at the empty platform, and no one stepped on, and the train began once again its patient progress along the rails, and he leaned his head once more against the cool dark glass, and tried to sink back toward rest. Almost at once, as though they had been waiting for him to settle again, the voices returned, soft and low, and now they spoke not of Tokyo Station but of something the man could not quite place, something the boy seemed almost shy to remember. The mother said, very gently, that there had been a moment when Kenchan was frightened, a moment when something had hurt, and the boy answered that he could not really remember the pain, only that his mother had been with him, and so it had been all right. She told him, in the quiet voice mothers used to make heavy things smaller, that she was glad he had not been afraid, and that she was glad they had taken this train, the blue one, because he had always loved the blue ones above all others. The man listened, his eyes still closed, and he found himself thinking, in the slow indirect way half-asleep minds think, that there was something tender in the conversation, but also something he could not name, a faint cool current running beneath the warmth. Then the boy, with a small bright lift of excitement, said that the level crossing was coming up soon, and the mother answered yes, almost there, and the man heard the familiar metallic chime of a railway crossing far ahead through the open seam of the window. He opened his eyes without quite meaning to, and looked out into the dark countryside, where the rice paddies lay in flat black squares, and far down the curve of the track he could see the faint red eye of a level crossing signal, blinking patiently in the field. As the train carried him closer, he thought he saw two small figures standing at the crossing, a tall slim shape and a smaller one beside it, two silhouettes painted faintly against the pale grey of the crossing arms, which had already lowered for the train. It looked, in that uncertain glance, almost as if the two figures were stepping forward beneath the lowered barrier, the way one occasionally sees country children do in summer, in places where the trains are slow and the rules are loose, although it is never wise. A small sharp sound rose from the front of the train, the urgent breath of an emergency brake, and at the same moment a low dull thud passed through the floor of the carriage, the kind of impact that one feels more in the bones than in the ears. A fine spray crossed the window beside him, dark in the dim glass, and his body understood before his mind did, and he was already on his feet, his coat slipping from his lap, his heart loud in his chest, his hands reaching toward the door at the end of the car. But when he looked up, fully upright now. The train was running smoothly again, the brakes silent, the windows clean, the rice paddies passing by outside in their calm endless rows, as if no crossing had been reached and no signal had blinked at all. He stood there for a long moment, his hand still reaching for nothing, listening to the heavy drum of his own pulse, and he turned slowly, very slowly, to look back along the carriage, but the seats behind him were empty as they had been before. He told himself, as one does in such moments, that he had simply been dreaming again, that the wine had thickened his thoughts, that the half-sleep had stitched together the gentle voices of a remembered family with the quiet anxiety of a tired man riding a late train alone. He felt, for a passing second, almost ashamed of himself, a grown man in a quiet carriage, frightened by his own dozing mind, and he sat down again, smoothed his coat across his lap, and tried to breathe slowly until his heart quieted. The train carried him on through the dark, through small unlit halts where no one waited, through narrow cuttings where the trees pressed close to the windows, and through wide flat stretches where the moonlight lay over the fields like a thin layer of water. He did not sleep again, although his eyes were heavy, because some part of him, some quiet, careful part, was now alert in a way that did not invite rest, and so he watched the reflection of the carriage in the dark glass, and counted the stations as they came and went. After a long while the conductor's voice came through the speakers, unhurried and polite, announcing the terminal station, and the train began to slow, and beyond the window the lights of the small town platform appeared in soft scattered pools. He gathered his coat and his bag and stood, holding the strap above him, and he walked carefully toward the front doors of the carriage, his shoes clicking softly on the worn floor, his shoulders stiff from sleep and from something that was not quite sleep. As he reached the door area and looked up at the small dark window set into the panel, he became aware, distinctly, of a presence behind him, a feeling that did not belong to him alone, the simple plain sense that someone was standing in the empty carriage at his back. He heard, beneath the noise of the slowing wheels, a soft irregular sound, the sound of small drops falling onto the floor, the kind of sound a wet umbrella makes when it has been left to drip in the entrance of a house. He told himself not to look, the way one tells oneself, walking home through a dark lane, not to look back at a footstep, but his eyes lifted of their own accord, and they found the dim reflection in the door's glass, and they saw what was reflected there. What he saw, in that pale uncertain mirror, was a young woman holding a small child in her remaining arm, and the shape of them was such that he understood, without needing to be told, that something terrible had happened to them, somewhere, sometime, on a track much like this one. He understood that the harm was old, that whatever pain had come for this mother and her son had come long ago and was over, and that what stood behind him now was not the harm itself but only the quiet shape of love that had outlived it. The child rested against the mother in the way small children rest, his head tucked into her shoulder, and the mother held him with the steady patience of someone who has been holding him for many years and who plans to hold him for many more. The boy looked at the man with the one eye that was turned toward him, and the look was not angry, and it was not pleading, and it was not anything that one could have used as a story afterwards, only the tired, soft gaze of a sleepy child near the end of a long ride. The man's legs gave way beneath him without ceremony, the way legs sometimes do when the body decides for itself that it has carried enough, and he sat down where he stood, his coat sliding from his arm, his bag tipping quietly against the door. He did not remember, afterwards, very much of what came next, only that the train had stopped, and that the doors had opened with their gentle hiss, and that the cold platform air had moved into the carriage like something coming home. A station attendant, an older man in the dark uniform of the small country line, found him there, and lifted him with the patient strength of someone who has lifted other tired travelers from other late trains, and walked him slowly across the empty platform. He was led into the small office at the end of the station, a warm, plain room with a kettle steaming softly on a low stove and a calendar of mountains pinned crookedly to one wall, and a cup of water was placed quietly into his hand. He drank the water slowly, and he watched the steam rise from the kettle, and he listened to the small ordinary sounds of a station office at the end of its long working day, and after a while his hand stopped trembling and his breath grew steady again. He did not ask the station attendant what he most wanted to ask, the question about whether anything had ever happened on that line, the question about whether a young mother and her child had ever stepped under a barrier on a quiet country evening years before. He did not ask, because he understood, sitting there with the cup warm in his palms, that if the answer were yes he might not be able to bear the weight of it, and that some questions are better carried home unanswered, in silence, with care. He thought, in the slow, soft way that thoughts come when shock is finally beginning to recede, that perhaps the mother had not wanted to frighten him, and that perhaps she had simply wanted, for one night, to ride the blue train her son had loved. He thought that perhaps she had been doing that for a long time already, getting on at one quiet halt and getting off at another, holding her son, telling him about Tokyo Station and the great old Kokutetsu hubs they had never reached together. And he thought, because he was a kind enough man to allow himself such thoughts, that this was not, in the end, a haunting in the way the word is usually meant, but only the long patient memory of a love that had not learned how to put itself down. The attendant walked him out to the small taxi rank when he was ready, and the night air was cool and a little damp, the way country air tends to be in those long hours after the last train has finished its work and gone to sleep in its shed. A single taxi waited under the lamp at the corner, its driver dozing lightly behind the wheel, and the man climbed into the back seat and gave his address in a quiet voice, and the driver nodded as if late riders were nothing strange to him at all. The taxi moved through the small town and out into the lanes between the rice paddies, and the rice paddies in turn gave way to the low scattered houses of the man's neighborhood, and at last the car came to a stop outside the gate of his own home. He paid the fare and stepped out, and stood for a moment looking up at the dark windows of his house, where his wife was sleeping and his own small child was sleeping in a small futon down the hall, and he felt the simple wonder of those two breathing rooms. He let himself in quietly, the way husbands do at such hours, slipping his shoes off in the genkan, the entryway, and listening to the gentle settled silence of a house that is asleep but holding a place open for him on the other side of the door. He looked in, very softly, on the small futon where his own son slept, and he saw the rise and fall of the small chest under the cotton quilt, and he stood in the doorway for what was perhaps a minute, perhaps a little longer, just watching that quiet rhythm. He did not wake the child, of course, and he did not wake his wife, but he stood there long enough to feel the warmth of the room settle into him, and he understood, in a way he could not have explained, that he had been given something that night, as well as shown something. He had been shown how love, when it is real, does not always know how to end, and he had been given the small ordinary gift of his own family asleep in their own rooms, breathing easily under their own quilts, on a night when nothing terrible had happened to them at all. He went to his own bed at last, and he lay down beside his wife, and he listened to her slow even breathing, and to the small distant ticking of a clock in the hallway, and to the faint sound of a late wind moving through the cedar tree in the garden. He thought, as he drifted at last towards sleep, of the young mother on the train, and he wished her, with the soft unspoken kindness that one wishes things to strangers in the dark, a long quiet ride, and a gentle last station, whenever she chose to step down. He never spoke about that night to anyone for a very long time, not because he was ashamed, but because he sensed that words would press the memory too hard, and that some things are best kept the way one keeps a folded letter at the back of a drawer. In the years that followed, he continued to take the same train, in the same direction, at the same unremarkable hour, and on most evenings he slept a little, and on most evenings he woke at his own station and walked home through the cool air of the lanes. He was, perhaps, a slightly gentler man afterwards, a little more patient with tired strangers on platforms, a little slower to hurry his own son out the door in the morning, a little more inclined to look up at the sky on his short walk home from the station. And sometimes, when the last train hummed quietly through the fields and the level crossings blinked their soft red eyes in the distance, he would feel a faint warmth at his shoulder, and he would understand, without turning, that the carriage was not entirely empty, and that this was, in its way, all right. For now, in this quiet hour, the train has reached its last stop, and the platform lamps are burning softly, and the station attendant is closing the office for the night, and the kettle on the low stove is no longer steaming, and the small town is settling under its blanket of stars. Somewhere in that town a man is asleep beside his wife, and his son is asleep in a small futon down the hall, and somewhere along the line a young mother is riding gently into the dark with her child held safely against her shoulder, and neither of them is afraid. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, as the rails grow cool, and the lanterns dim one by one, and the long quiet country settles, at last, into the deep soft sleep of a Japan that has finished its day, and is ready, now, to dream. We've reached the end of tonight's stories. The voices have all gone quiet now. The strangers who shared their secrets, the families who carried their small sorrows, the rooms where odd little things happened in the dark, all of them are folded away, settled, finished. There is nothing more to listen for tonight. Nothing more you need to follow. You can let it all drift past you now, the way a slow current carries leaves downstream, somewhere far from here, somewhere you do not have to watch.